That was a great intro song. I feel like that touched me. That was good.
That was excellent. Good choice. Good
well,
choice.
Speaking of which, more professional in the future, because I was not making fun of you exactly for the sound check idea, but the moment that it started playing, it picked up on my Bluetooth speaker over there and started playing it double in the room. So anyway. So this is the first episode. I'm Dr. Brent Turvey, and this is Melanie Inglis. I want to just take a moment to talk about what we plan on using this space for, because I think it's going to be great. We've been wanting to do this for a very long time. We've done a couple with Aurelio, and those have been very good. And today, Dr. Coronado is producing to help us out.
He's in the background.
He's in the back. I'm not showing him, though. I'm not showing him. He's not camera ready. This takes time. So
I'm sure it does.
It takes a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
So each week, we are going to talk about a different subject related to or within forensic criminology that focuses on our work related to violent crime, and always with an emphasis on vulnerable populations and always with a human rights perspective. And there are a number of topics we're going to talk about. Melanie, why don't you tell us some of the things you want to talk about in this space that we create?
I have so many things I want to talk about. I can't even start listing them off.
That's why you're here.
There's too many things to talk about.
Well, we talked about in the past, we talked about one of the bigger issues being the justice system in general, but in specific, the way that people tend to believe that law enforcement has certain capacities or capabilities or a certain response to certain things and treats victims in a certain way. And through our that there is the theory of that, which exists on paper. Mm-hmm. And that is true. And these protocols exist, and these ideas exist, and these laws exist. But the execution of those laws by individual officers or individual agencies and the policies they adopt is very different. It's a very different reality. So that's one of the issues we're going to talk about. Tell us about your thoughts on that, because that was one of the things you said I need to be talking about this. This
is a major issue everywhere, and I think a lot of people, as we've said before in other podcasts, have put law enforcement on a pedestal, and there is a lot of things that are not properly done or executed, which we're seeing in our casework, and we're seeing it a lot with Please Bring Me Home in cold cases, where the investigations cease to exist after about 3 months of someone reported going missing. So there's a lot of things that need to be discussed and looked at, in addition to the fact that victims are almost non-existent in the case. It's all about the offender and who they are and what happened and the details of all of these things, where the victim goes untalked about, unnoticed, and there's nothing about them or their families. No support for their families either.
You said it exactly right. In the literature that exists on what's called intersectionality, we'll be talking about that this episode as well. In the literature that exists on intersectionality, this is a reference to the concept of erasing the victim, erasing a narrative. And the narrative that you're erasing is the one that you don't want to be responsible for. So you erase people, or you erase context, or you erase consequences or circumstances so that you don't have to be responsible for addressing them. And it exists in the way we talk about problems. It exists in the way we write about problems. And it exists in the way we approach problems. And that's one of the most important things to me, is to start building tools, internationally recognized useful tools that work in every crime context, so that we can approach these problems, approach these victims, crimes, the criminal, the crime, all of it, in a way that doesn't leave anyone behind, doesn't leave anyone out, so that all the perspectives can be taken into account. There's I think it's called transperspectival analysis. It's really interesting. So I love that you said that, because the erasing of the victim is the biggest problem. And like you said, when the victim is dead, the victim's family, leaving them out of the process. There is this notion that law enforcement is very inclusive about that, and it's not. We have somebody from the UK. We have a couple people joining us from the United States and Canada, and we have quite a few people from Latin America. You are all welcome with us today. Let me see here. The other thing is, we want to talk about not only the state of criminal investigation, but the state of criminal psychology and the state of forensic science as it exists within the justice system. Not the theory, the application, the problems with application, so we can get better, right? I mean, that's my goal. Tell me what your goal is, other than yelling at me and and reminding me of my limitations on a hourly basis. The minutely, we have minutes. So other than that,
pretend. No, that's the only reason. That's the only reason I'm here. Keep you humble. Somebody has to do it.
That's going to take more than an hour. That's like a long-term goal that I'm sure
we have an hour every other week. So
we'll get it done. You can't climb Everest in a day. You just can't do it.
So I do want to raise awareness. Like you said, the theory is there and it's written in textbooks, it's written in protocols, but the application is not present. And we see it every single day in all of our cases.
Yeah, we really do. Let's talk about you a little bit. Today we actually released a profile of you today. It timed well with the podcast. That was genius. Somebody did that. Some genius made that decision.
I think it was the one behind you. The one behind you.
Well, he's the only genius in the room. I can tell you that.
That's right.
I don't want to be on the hook for that. So the issue is that you do a lot of stuff, and you're on this really interesting path, and I'd like for you to share that path with other people so that they can understand the value of it. I think it's really good. I think it's an important narrative that needs to be heard. So tell us about your path, where you've been, where you are, and where you want to go. And that's kind of what the document does. So walk us through that.
Okay, so my educational background would be, I have a paralegal degree. That was the first thing that I followed through with. And then I have the private investigator and security license. That would be my educational background, along with the diploma program that I did through the FCI for crime scene assessments and profiling. Mm-hmm. And then what I'm going to do right now, I'm in the residency as it states, so I'm working cases alongside you and learning how to put all of these theories into practice from a human rights perspective. Now, when the residency is finished, I'm going to definitely enroll in the master's program, get some more education under my belt, and then continue my work in the US and then also in Canada with a concentration on domestic violence and femicides and homicides and sexual assaults and things of that manner.
So not a lot's going to change in terms of your case focus. You're just getting better at it.
Yeah.
I can attest.
Right.
Can you tell people what it's like to have to work with me on these things? I mean, we're not physically in the same space. You're in Canada and I'm in Latin America at the moment. Tell people what that's like, because I'm sure there are people who think, oh, that must be so great. And you obviously don't have that view every day. So
it's fantastic. It's seamless. It's never frustrating. Everything's done in perfect order. All of those great things.
Yeah, that's very generous. Now this time I need you to say the truth and mean it.
Well, because we aren't in the same physical place, I do find that it can be difficult, and I don't think it's more time consuming, but sometimes things can slip through the cracks, or there's a lot of back and forth. Whereas if we were in the same space or in the same office or something like that, it would be, I feel like it would be different, but I know we are talking about you. So
yeah, I get hit more. That's what would happen.
Probably.
There will be things heading my direction from your direction to land on me.
That's right. And we would start things at the time that we've advertised them as well.
Oh, that's a really important thing to do. I'm sure there's somebody who's going to get right on that.
Yeah.
My problem is always time. That is the most valuable commodity that I have left these days. I have about 30 plus open cases. You'll be delighted to hear that last week I took in 3 more new cases. I do my work during the week. I write on my textbook projects. And then in the weekends, I actually work my cases. That's when I get the time to do it. And fortunately, through the residency program was started because there was a desire on the part of more advanced practitioners that had gone through our programs to learn how to apply the concepts in person. And we have 3 residents. You, Jill Bopp from Florida, and Lena Amiri from Dubai. She's with the Royal Dubai Police Force. And you're all doing essentially the same kind of work on the same kinds of cases. What you're doing is you're doing case intake. You take it in, you examine it, look for what's there, what's not there, what needs to be there, what we can ask for. Then on top of that, you identify weaknesses and strengths in the evidence that's in the case that's made. Then preparing timelines and victimological information. and putting that into a presentation form. And I also have a workbook for each one of you to do that hopefully eventually you will no longer need in order to answer specific questions about the case. I hope that the other residents are listening so that they know I've just given away a big secret, which is I want you to use the workbook so that you know when you don't need it. Because by the way, you were the first person to say the workbook doesn't work on my case.
Well, it didn't. It was very difficult.
Yeah. Well, this isn't mission easy.
That's not my point. The point is the particular wording and the questioning in the workbook did not help in my case, just because it seemed to be, well, it was a slightly different type of case, I guess, that we were looking at.
Yeah, it was. The workbooks are designed for homicides. Let's put it very bluntly. And you could even apply it to a sex crime. But we have some different kinds of cases. We get wrongful death cases. We get domestic violence cases. We get cases where there are different kinds of intersectional issues. It's not just about rape and homicide. There are a lot more different kinds of cases out there that need our attention, from whether it's simple assault to a shooting case where no one gets killed, or a drug-related homicide. And you've worked them all at this point. You've worked a bunch of them for me, which I really appreciate. You're doing very well.
Thank you.
No problem. So what we want to talk about this week a little bit, and it goes well in hand with two of our big themes. One is intersectionality, and the other one is vulnerable populations and human rights. So let's talk a little bit about intersectionality and vulnerable populations before we get too far ahead of ourselves, because I think that there's a real misunderstanding of what that is and what that means in North America. Not in Mexico so much, kind of, they have the languages there, but in the US, we work really hard to deprive ourselves of that language and of that history and of that context. In Canada, is this something that you guys talk about, vulnerable populations or intersectionality, or is that something that's foreign to you guys up there?
No, I would say that we don't talk about that very often. This was new terminology for me when I started working with you guys. So it's not something that is spoken of very often here. Yep.
So first, let's talk about what a vulnerable population is. A vulnerable population is someone who's protected. Usually there's a governmental edict or there's governmental regulations that say this particular group of people is protected because they're particularly vulnerable. It includes indigenous populations, women, children, people who have physical disabilities, people who have mental issues. It includes people who are impoverished. It includes people who have of different, let's say, different sexual identities are protected. There's a lot, and race and religion. Those are big ones. All right. So people of different classes are protected by virtue of their involvement in that class, because that class is either marginalized or it has been harassed and attacked and that sort of thing. But that brings us to the issue of intersectionality. And intersectionality is about the deliberate oppression of people, the deliberate erasure of people and their vulnerability by virtue of the fact that it can be done because they're in different vulnerable categories. The original research was done in the 80s by a woman named Crenshaw, a black social activist and researcher named Crenshaw, and she's just really good. Her material is fantastic. I'm able to access it really easily, even as an old white guy. And it's true. It's true. We'll talk about that in a second. But the issue is intersectionality means she originally was studying why Black women who are in poverty and have less opportunities and access. So intersectionality is about the extent to which someone's different characteristics put them in a place where they're vulnerable, where they can be exploited, where they can be oppressed, where they don't have agency, and where essentially their existence can be erased or ignored. And we see this in the response of the criminal justice community to people who are in this intersectional category. And examining that issue has actually really been helpful for me, because I'm not a person who experiences that on a daily basis. I'm a person who experiences the opposite. I personally benefit from the system that's in place right now. The justice system that's in place, the government system that's in place, is designed to benefit people exactly like me. And anyone who's not exactly like me is designed to oppress and exploit. Well, another group is immigrant status. That's a really good one. And that's not a concept you guys talk about too much in Canada, even though you might have some issues with that, just like we do in the States, or I don't know.
I
You
think
tell me.
there's a select group of people that might be discussing this, but I don't think that it is something that is public knowledge or a public discussion as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Well, what I have found, and I want to get your response to this, what I have found is when I talk to this about other people, when I talk about this with other people, especially people from the United States, they immediately get angry. When you even mention the word human rights, or if you even mention the word intersectionality, or sort of even talk about racism or talk about institutional or structural violence, Americans get enraged. Can you talk to us about that in Canada? Because that's the conversation. I'm even having the conversation is really hard.
I think people, in my experience, they get really defensive, and they want to talk about the views that they have that sometimes are passed down from generations. It's a learned behavior and a learned opinion almost. There's no trying on their part to go out and learn anything for themselves, or research something and then have an opinion based on what they've researched on their own. And it's very defensive when you bring up things like this, because I'm wondering if they just shut down, they don't know what to say, or it makes them uncomfortable. I don't see a lot of anger. It's just this defense mechanism that comes over, and this immediate kind of stonewalling, just shut down and let it go. Just don't talk about it.
Is that because Canadians are nicer than people in the U.S.? Because we're violent. We start shooting at each other. That's what we do.
Yes, we're all very sweet here.
Yeah. Well, we have. I will say this: we do have more mass shootings than you do. That's for sure. Because when we get angry, this is what we do instead of actually dealing with the problems that we have. I will just say that I see anger, and I think a lot of it comes from a couple of reasons. One is most American is, Aurelio and I, we talked about this all the time about what is American culture? Does America even have culture? And what we have is a culture of consumerism. That's our primary culture. What we don't have is a lot of empathy for anything else. We see success in terms of money. We see success in terms of possessions, and that's a narrative that's imposed upon us. In order to keep that engine going, there is a concerted effort to completely wipe out any history that does not exalt that reality, that does not exalt materialism, that does not exalt capitalism, that does not exalt the acquisition of wealth as the only sort of measure of worth as a person. And that, I think, is our dangerous culture that we're in. But I think we're one of the only cultures in the world that has made such a proficient practice of not teaching our actual history to the next generation. In fact, the last generation does the best it can to hide death, sex, and inequality, inequity, exploitation of any group. We do the best we can to hide that from the current generation so that they can believe the myth that we want to sell them, which is that everything is fine, everything is great. And if you're bringing up the past, then you're just trying to cause problems. So that's the reality. Do you see that from your perspective in Canada? Do you see America that way, or how do you see America? I'm very curious because I never can tell. I just think people look at Americans and go, "What the hell are you guys doing?"
For the most part.
Yeah.
No, I would say that that's probably the assumption I would make from what I can see from here. But I would say here in Canada that a couple of the things you said, that success, or well, I guess success is based a lot on materialistic things here as well. I find that there's not a lot of perspective other than, what kind of job you have, what kind of car you drive, how big is your house. Those things all exist here too. And for the majority of people, I do see that there is empathy, but based in current events, I would say that I have seen very little empathy coming out of the general population based on what's going on right now, along with a diluted version of historical events within the educational system here as well.
Diluted. That's a really nice way of putting it. Diluted. I would. My son used to come home from school every day and he'd say, "I got to go watch YouTube." And I'm like, "Why?" And he goes, "Because I got to go unlearn all the nonsense my teachers just tried to tell me that I know is not true." And that's a sad reality for a lot of students. They're in this place where now, not only do we not trust government because they're not trustworthy, but we also now can't even trust our teachers because they're forced to teach a government curriculum that doesn't actually bear any reality to the truth or to real context. And I think that leads us well into what I suggest that we talk about today as our opening topic. which is the problem with the residential schools. And I say it not lightly. I am not making light of this. And I say the problem because the last 20 years, I've lived in a little community called Sitka, Alaska, which has a very large Native population that was there for hundreds of years, if not more, before Russian and Norwegian settlers came and sort of took over. The residential schools that we talk about in Alaska still exist. Residential schools are essentially a place that's created by a colonizing force, whether it's the Spaniards in Mexico or the Russians or the United States, the colonists in Alaska, or the European colonists in Canada. They set up schools for the indigenous population to go and to learn to speak English, to learn to dress appropriately, like a European appropriately, not like a native. And then they go there and it's designed essentially to erase their culture, to erase their language. And they were punished for any violations. They were separated from their families and their cultural context. And in many cases, they were brutalized. They were tortured, experimented upon, and sexually assaulted to the point where some of them were actually killed, actually died. In the United States and Canada, this was done very much in joint concert effort for billions of dollars with the Catholic Church. And what would happen you can talk about this a little bit, but what would happen in the United States, in Alaska in particular, the Catholic Church, whenever it had a priest that was accused of molesting somebody, they'd send him to Alaska. And that's why you have so many redheaded Alaskan natives, because Alaskan natives are not redheaded, but it comes from the Catholic priests who came up there who had red hair and were having sex with natives. And there was a way of essentially promoting, getting rid of the history, getting rid of the context, getting rid of the desire to resist, which was there, and then treating them essentially as slaves, whether they be sexual slaves or for physical labor. That's the other thing that these schools were really good at. Tell us about your understanding of the schools. That's a broad, sweeping view of the school system that was set up in the United States to essentially acculturate the indigenous population, which is nothing short of a cultural and physical genocide. But tell us your experience with how you see it in Canada.
You pretty much said everything that I would have said. I was going to touch on they were created by a branch of the government in combination with the Catholic school. And in Canada, there was estimated in the settlement agreement, which we can talk about in a bit, there was 139 schools that were listed on that settlement agreement. There was more schools that were active, and the children, I think there was about estimated 150,000 children went to these schools, the age of 4 to 16, and were just the stories that brutally attacked, and there was a lot of forceful abortions and nutrition. They weren't fed well, and there was a lot of abuse that they suffered, and a lot of kids never returned from those schools. And that's what we're starting to see here a lot in Canada. As you know, there are they were listed as mass graves, but they are just unmarked graves of thousands of children at this point that are starting to be found on each of these sites.
That's a lot to take in. And what I want to say is let's get to the hard truth about this. I really want to live up to our title, because you and I, one of the reasons we decided to call it this is because when you and I talk, we always say things that are really painful but need to be said. You know what I mean? It's like, let's rip the Band-Aid off and let's get right to the essential here. There's no political correctness. There's no attempt to try to do anything but say what happened, what really was going on here. And from my perspective, I want to get your response to this. From my perspective, the notion of bringing in a religious group to work on behalf of the government to enculturate or indoctrinate any culture is condescending. It's condescending at best. And by that, I mean, there's this fantasy that we sell to white people that the land was, unused, and the natives were not using it correctly, and they were all behind in technology, as though the rise in technology is also a rise in the quality of a person. Instead of it being that these people had their own system of life and government and society that existed that worked just fine, where they didn't need gunpowder, and they weren't interested in, it wasn't always about war and killing and resources. They had their own society, their own culture, their own people. all right, their own ideas of how to do stuff. And it just didn't align with the materialism and technology that were being promoted by European settlers or European colonizers, essentially. Settler is such a nice word, but I'll fall into that trap because that's the language I was raised with. But this mission to bring Christianity is really about a mission to bring social control. It's a mission to essentially prevent the population from having knowledge about why they should resist what's going on, about the atrocities that are committed to get the kids into that school. All right. And what that means once they leave, to rob them of their culture and then put them into a society that will not value them until they have lost all the color in their skin over time. And that is the danger that I see. It's very, very condescending. So it used to be back in the day, whenever I would hear a friend of mine, a Christian friend, say, oh, I'm going on a mission. We're going to go to China. We're going to go to Haiti. We're going to go to South America. We're going to go to Africa. We're going to go on a mission to help these poor savages, these poor impoverished savages. Do you know that there are groups in other countries like Japan and China who collect money on behalf of the poor in the United States because of our conditions here? That is a thing that exists. They do the same thing with us. It's this narrative that we create that these other cultures are somehow less than us because they have not been properly industrialized or don't have the right technology and don't have the right material goods. What we're really doing is creating consumers. That's what we're doing. That's what Christianity does. That's what our government does. And we can see no better example of this than in these residential schools and the consequences for that. Can you talk to me just a little bit about that? Respond to the notion that, because when I see the images of like a white priest or a white group of young white girls going into a mission with shovels, and we're going to drink water for these people, and they just need us so badly. To me, it feels so condescending, and the image is so wrong. Tell me what you think about that, or if you think I'm way off base.
No, I don't think you're off base. I do also agree that it is condescending, but what we've done as a society is make it look like they're doing the right thing, right? And make it look like they're the ones that are helping and they're fixing the problem. And what would anyone do without us, right?
Right. We're so great.
Yeah. It's still even here that the idea of what was happening at these schools, and the responses I would get concerning is a nice way to put it, but we were getting responses like, well, we all knew this happened. Just get on with it. We all knew that it existed. We just have to move on. Yeah. I don't understand the outlook behind some of these things.
Well, what you're hitting upon is this idea that if you just start from right now and move forward, then everything's going to be fine. We don't have to acknowledge what happened before because that's just you're being a troublemaker. I get that a lot from my American friends, colleagues, and even family. There is this desire to not acknowledge what was done to the indigenous community in order for this country to exist, in order for your country to exist.
Right. And now all of this was coming to the forefront of the media and things like that. And then it came to a halt because of, COVID. Everything came to a halt that we weren't able to. Please bring me home. We were going to go to some locations. We were going to utilize our equipment and help. And we were going to try to help GPR these sites for the unmarked graves, and everything just stopped. And it's no longer in conversation anymore. It's just completely ceases to be in conversation. Yeah. It's like it happened and then this happened and now we just forget about it.
Yeah, we have to wait until COVID dies down before we can even go back to address this problem because everyone's so worried about just surviving the next year if they can, which I totally get. I totally get that. And the things that we're talking about are rather large, but we need to start the conversation somewhere. And the Native community has been trying to have this conversation for generations. The African American community or the Black community in the United States has been trying to have this conversation for generations. And we have been doing nothing but suppress it because it doesn't benefit us to have it. If we have it out in the open, then there has to be an acknowledgement that there's a structure in place that white people benefit from that exploits and marginalizes and directly hurts, or even to an extent to the modern day, essentially enslaves these vulnerable populations and exploits them. That system works very well for white people. It does not work well for everybody else. And that's a conversation it's very difficult to have with somebody who just wants everything to go away. No, the problem is you're sitting on this. One of the most interesting things I read recently, I was telling you about this, and I was telling the group about it, is a recent book by a graphic novel based on her research experience. It's a book called Wake, and it's by Dr. Rebecca Hall. She's a social activist lawyer with a Harvard education. She went to Harvard, she went to Berkeley. She's very intelligent. I've been talking to her actually privately. She's a very smart person, and I'm trying to get her to come help us with our program actually. And we're going to have some conversations about that. But her book is about research into the slave trade. And it's like, oh God, not that. Holy crap. Who wants to read about that? Well, I did, because I did something that I think I understand, but I really don't. What I realized is I truly did not. The issue was that we have entire structures, the biggest companies that exist on this planet, like Lloyd's of London, other insurance companies, Lloyd's of London underwrites like 95% of all insurance on the planet. And their company was built on the slave trade. By that, I mean to say, a person could be bought and sold and transported, and they were therefore insured. So anytime a slave died in transport, or they fought back and had to be killed or executed, they would collect insurance money on that. There was insurance. They were paying, insurance premiums were being paid for them, and they were collecting insurance on that. The same thing is true in the United States. If you had a slave population in the South, you had insurance companies in the North and companies in the North that were invested in the cotton trade, invested in the money that was being made off. You could take a mortgage out on a slave to buy another slave. So this consumption of human beings to build wealth in the North and the South and in Europe is based on the destruction of indigenous populations and also the exploitation of African-American populations. So both. And that, disentangling that history from the current economic reality is impossible. Right? That's the book right there. So if nobody takes anything else away from this talk today, this is a book that will explain to you intersectionality and how it goes to the modern day. Because Rebecca Hall doesn't just talk about the history that she uncovered of the women in the slave, basically women led the slave revolts most of the time. And the reason why is because the white people like to have sexual access to the black women. And to do that, they had to be free to move around. And because they were free to move around, they could change messages, they could share keys, they could get access to areas of the house where the weapons were. But they were written out of the history because the assumption that white European historians made is that they didn't matter, that they didn't actually matter, that they didn't have these skills or abilities. They weren't putting it together. So they were wiped out. They were erased from that history. And it's not just about that. It's about her journey trying to do the research with people who are blocking her, people in the academic or institutional levels. And I would like to know, just from your perspective, you have a very different perspective than me, and I know I talk too much. I want you to tell me your perspective on these issues as we've been talking about, as you've been thinking about them, in terms of the erasure of women from history, the erasure of there she is right there. She's on the top, and then there's the graphic, the artist who did the penciling and the drawings. He's a genius. They're both very gifted individuals. They both have a very powerful voice that I think needs to be heard. At least it really helped me. It really.
What I was going to ask you to comment on is a little bit more about what the pushback was for her within the academic community, because I find that's very interesting, and I think that people need to hear about it.
Well, can you tell us your academic journey first? Because I think I want to contextualize this, because you have a very specific academic journey. We all have the same. We all want to get degrees and get educated, but it's different for different people. For me, as a white male, I can ignore stuff and I can just do what I want, kind of, and not take it personally. But for you as a female, how was it for you going through education before you got to where you are with us?
Going through education as in the college and university level?
Yeah, when it was something that you were trying to do for yourself, because I want to compare and contrast that with her journey, because I think it's interesting. I think there's a comparison to be made. I
would say that it was difficult, given there's a few roadblocks here in Canada anyway, not just for being a female, but in the industry and in the profession that I wanted to go into. But I would relate more to the education that I was undergoing to get onto the police force. It was very difficult as a woman, and there was a lot of blockages and a lot of pushback to learn and to apply for these types of positions within the educational grounds. And there was a lot of I don't know how there was it was very difficult because it was coming into the man's world and being part of a group that we weren't welcome in. So it was very hard. It was a struggle, like 8 years to try to get even a little bit further, just to be pushed back again because I was a woman, and my education, I wasn't able to get what they wanted, and I don't know. There was just a lot of pushback.
You're being very kind, and I appreciate that.
I
want to just say the kinds of pushback that you're being very kind, because the kind of pushback that I tend to see is a couple things. Yeah, you are. You really are. That's why you're here. The first thing is the condescension. Obviously, well, young lady, this maybe isn't for you type of attitude. That's the first thing. The condescension with maybe this isn't really right for you. This is more of this is work and heroes work, and we're here to protect you, not to have you protect us. That doesn't make sense to us. So that's first. If you want to relate it directly to trying to get onto the police force versus my college and university experience, it's very different. Trying to get onto the police force was, I heard things like, you're too pretty, you can't do that. If you do that and you go to police college, you're gonna have a lot of problems, and you're gonna have to shut your mouth and just go along with it. The things that I was told as a woman trying to get into this career, and that was before I was even going to the school. This was the application process to be accepted to go to the school. And it was just, you're not, you wouldn't sexual harassment is part of the culture. Just learn how to deal with it, right?
You're just a fragile young lady. You won't be able to do anything.
Yeah, that's not true. Let me make sure nobody thinks that anymore. So the first part is the condescending. Yeah, not anymore. The first part is the condescending attitude that people have. And the second part, obviously, is the being warned up that, hey, you're a female and you're kind of attractive. So guess what? Expect to have some sexual harassment thrown your way. Either just don't take it personally or whatever. Maybe you want my number. I don't know. That kind of stuff.
If you go along with it, you'll get further. I was told that. Yeah.
And that's part of keeping your mouth shut. Not just either keep your mouth shut and let it happen, or participate. Take on the male attributes and participate. Become a shitty person. That's because that's the culture you're going into. The comparison contrasting I would make is that as an African American female, as a black female, Dr. Hall relates, and this is her story, not mine, that when she went to different places to try to get access to things, whether it was a course or a private business or and often with women in charge of these things, in charge of giving her access, these people would make it very difficult. They were always white, and they were always making it very difficult for her to access, or giving her looks, or giving her problems, trying to find a reason not to give her access, trying to find a reason not to let her, because once they found out what she was studying, it made them very uncomfortable, because the records that were kept, because this was property and it was insured, the records that are kept are excruciatingly detailed, whether it's captain's logs or insurance company logs or court records for what was done when people were executed or people were imprisoned. The United States, or the colonial states, and then the United States, we were very good at keeping records because of the European model that we were following, because of the European insurance that we had on the slaves, the people, on the product and the equipment in both North and South. So this was very much about money. I mean, you can say, oh, it's about race. Yes, it is. It's about exploiting race for money and vulnerable. And there are lots of groups that get exploited, that are made vulnerable in order to exploit their labor, or to exploit them as physical labor, or for sex trafficking. And in the case of slaves from Africa, or even the indigenous population, it was both. They were using them for both. And that is another. I'm very interested in the sexual assault dimension of these residential facilities, because I haven't spoken to anyone who's come out of those facilities, or who was raised by someone in those facilities. I haven't seen any history that doesn't talk about the rape, that doesn't talk about the sexual assault. It was though this sexual access to these kids was baked in for the priesthood, was baked in for the instructors. Talk to me about that a little bit. Is that something that the conversation you guys have been having up there in Canada, or no?
There's not really a conversation that's being had anymore.
Right.
I do know when there was the settlement, I think it was in 2005, there was call centers set up, I guess that's what they would be called, where survivors of the residential schools would call in and tell their stories. So I've heard lots of these horrifying experiences that people have went through. But the conversation was just kind of, there was a public apology from the prime minister at the time, and there was some money. If you were eligible, I think the stats are that 80% of people that applied and were eligible that went through the residential school system were paid a certain amount of money. There was some lump sums. And then when we fast forward and when the unmarked graves were started to be found, then now we have money being put into it to do the searches, but there's not a conversation that's having. It's just, we're going to find it and we're going to apologize and then we're going to move on. That's it.
Throw some money, a little bit of money, maybe. A little bit of money, maybe.
Right. The stories are being either shut down. Like I've seen some go viral, but then they're gone. Yeah. They're just trying to eliminate all of the experiences being broadcasted to the entire world of what they endured when they were there.
Yeah. That's the erasure of history and the erasure of people. That's the real problem. I wanted to mention something that we talked about that you mentioned there, and that is that you have these schools being set up. You have the history that's there, that's evident. People not wanting to talk about it, even though the facts, the evidence, everything is right in front of us. Everything is right there. I really struggle with how you can solve a problem without identifying the component elements or the context that created that problem, or even the current benefits that we enjoy because of what happened there, and recasting it as some sort of necessary thing that had to happen to make this country great or to make our countries great. That's the history that we don't want to have. We don't want to have that conversation. We have this, for some reason, Americans have fetishized their history as though it is this sacrosanct thing that we have to constantly go back and fix it to make it look like we're all heroes, or look like we're based on this heroic triumph or something, when it really cost millions of lives and it crushed a lot of people and still continues to consume people. Do you guys have that identity problem in Canada too, or no? Because I know we do in the United States. We need to be seen as the gunslinging heroes all the time. I
think to a point, I would agree with that. I also think there's just a lot of ignorance around the whole thing. That, like I said, it was diluted before when we're going through school and things like that. And to bring it up now, there's a lot of ignorance around even how anything began. I don't feel like anyone truly knows what happened and the effects and the severity of what actually happened in the beginning. It was like pieces of it are missing, or they're just pretending not to understand.
Well, there's a really great documentary series that Aurelio just put up on there. If you could throw it back up there, Aurelio, that'd be great. This is on HBO. It's called Exterminate All the Brutes. It's based on a book that's of the same title. And it is a 4-part, I believe, documentary series that is excellent. And it talks about essentially the colonial urge from Europe to the United States and the exploitation of South America and Latin America and also Africa over time to build the wealth in Europe and the United States. And it goes all the way up until modern day. And it shows that connection, that where we can document to the penny almost exactly how much money in modern terms that we extracted from these continents, how many resources we extracted. My government will actually go in and destabilize the economies of other government to make it cheaper for them to invest and take their resources. We did it in Venezuela to take their oil and to take their rare earth minerals. It's one of the largest deposits of rare earth minerals and oil in the world is in Venezuela. It should be the wealthiest country on the planet. It should be like Dubai. It should be a gem on the coast of South America. And instead, it is impoverished. Everything is dollarized, and people are fleeing the country because the government there is so corrupt and has sold so many of its resources to the U.S., taken loans out, essentially made the country a slave to the European market, which is awful. This is a story that gets told over and over and over again. So the history exists, but I don't think the people who teach history have the language to understand it. And when I was getting my history degree, I was taught that the Civil War was not about slavery, it was about economics. But the point is, it was about the economics of slavery, because you couldn't have the wealth being built without slavery. You couldn't have the wealth being built without exploiting and destroying people and their lives. And there was this benefit of that, which is that now you had not only people working in labor, but there was also little breeding farms that they had where they were breeding slaves amongst each other, and also where you would have people that were spare rooms in that master's house where they could have sex with the more attractive female slaves as they subjectively determined. This whole thing has been going on for a very long time, and it hasn't. The laws have changed, but the nature and relationships haven't changed. Like the fight that we have in this country is still very much on, and still very much about fighting for our identity through history. And I think it's interesting that in Canada you're not having any conversation. I'm just wondering. I wonder always with myself, what's the identity of the United States? What's the identity of Canada now? What do you think? Because you guys don't have the gunslinger stuff. You don't. What do you have? What's your identity invested in when you think I'm a Canadian, therefore this is how the world sees me? Other than being nice.
Well, I don't really know what the perspective would be. The things I hear is that we are nice and we don't get involved and we want to make everything, peaceful. But I, just 1 second, I was going to ask you something that you said about the educational system, and I wanted your opinion. Do you think that somebody who does want to teach actual history and in its entirety, will we ever get to a point where they will be allowed to do so? Do you think that will ever happen based on any of these events that have happened and how it's being brought to the public eye?
Well, let's just back up and say that there's different layers of school, right? So this is why white people love to put their kids in private or Christian, what are essentially Christian schools, because they're going to be taught the correct history. Jesus was white, his apostles were white, Christianity is white, Christianity is American. When in fact, the Bible is missing white people. There are no white people in the Bible. Jesus was not white. Jesus was from the Middle East. He's very brown to dark, if not more. All right, maybe he was a Moor. I don't know. What matters is that control of that history is part of our cultural narrative, and there is a move to get white kids into wealthier schools or public or private schools, and then the inner city gets left. And what happens is that's where we put public housing. That's where we deprive minorities, vulnerable populations, of the ability to do banking, to buy food, to do anything but go shop at the general store. So essentially, they're forced into these in many contexts. Vulnerable populations are forced into education contexts where they're not going to learn anything but government approved curriculum, right? So the opportunity to learn real history only exists on YouTube in certain contexts and circumstances. That means you got to have somebody who's a vulnerable population who also has access to Wi-Fi and to internet and to a computer or to a phone, which maybe they don't. All right. So your bigger question is, do I think that it can? I think it can be taught. I think that just requires some courage on the part of teachers who actually are knowledgeable, instead of them buying into the same. Teach the facts, provide primary resources. When I look back on my own educational history, I realize that a lot of my teachers were expecting me to read more than I did, because they wouldn't tell us stuff didactically. They wouldn't say explicitly, this is the lesson. They'd ask us questions. What do you think the relevance of the cotton gin was? Wasn't that really important and a great technological achievement? And the answer is yes, it was great at making sure that the Civil War happened and forcing slaves to work more and longer hours, making slavery profitable again when it was dying out. It was really great at inducing genocide and keeping slavery alive. That's what it was great at. So those were the kinds of answers maybe they were looking for. So it takes a certain ingenuity to teach in this context, but I don't think teachers will ever be free to actually teach real documented history, because that history is controlled. The access to primary documents and primary resources is told. It's only through, I would say, renegades who are resisting, like Dr. Hall, who are doing this very off-script approach to historical storytelling, that really can land with people in a way that they can hear. I hope it can. I don't have a lot of faith that it will, because so far it hasn't.
And it has to reach people that are capable and willing to hear it as well.
You've really made a really important point there, which is that it's one thing to want to teach. It's another thing to be in a context where the people want to learn. If they don't want to learn, they won't. If somebody doesn't want to learn, they won't. And we have indoctrinated people with religion, with with ideology to the point where they can't hear anything that might erode that ideology, or else the whole life feels like a lie. They're so fragile that any idea that challenges them, even a little bit, that challenges what their perspective is, they get upset because they think that if someone else exists and is enjoying their life in a different way than them, then that somehow invalidates them. It's very narcissistic. And as we've established, I lack the narcissism gene, so I don't have that problem. So that's why I'm able to.
I don't think that's accurate. I don't think that's accurate.
No, why would you say so?
I'm going to have to disagree with you on that one.
I thought you might. No, I am just as bad as anyone else. I want to make that very clear. I'm not a perfect person. I'm barely a good person, but I am aware of my own limitations, and I like people around me who tell me when I'm wrong. So that's important. But the point is, the narcissism that requires is extensive, right? The narcissism of believing that other people's lives and pleasures have something to do with yours, like that their ability to experience pleasure differently than you is somehow affects you and that you need to control them. That's a very colonial idea because it's about controlling ideology. It's about wanting to believe that your own upbringing was not a waste, was not wrong. Because if it was, then you wasted your whole life and your life has no meaning. But the problem is that's not how life works. You're supposed to learn, develop, and adapt and explore and get more information and appreciate other cultures, other ideas, instead of trying to, consume them.
Yeah, and it is really difficult with the younger generations that are spending more time. There are younger generations trying to understand a little bit more. And when this all surfaced in Canada publicly, I mean, there was a lot of the younger generation looking into it. But then when they go to speak about it with the older generation in their family, then it becomes a problem. Everyone's defensive. People start getting angry about it. You're going against your religion. So there's no going forward when you're just continuously hitting roadblocks with everybody in your family or the older generation.
And that's a really important thing to understand, that we have an obligation to people who are younger than us, to our children, to our grandchildren, to talk about what was done, what wasn't done, what we haven't done, essentially what we haven't acknowledged. And that's a conversation we don't want to have in the States. We want to believe that everything we've done is to, an action movie soundtrack where we're being heroic. And that's the problem. That hasn't been the case. We keep invading countries and killing people. Like, oh my God, just recently, the most racist thing we've done recently in the last few days, we were trying to get our troops out of Afghanistan because we set an arbitrary time of moving everybody out. We made an agreement with the Taliban to do that. I think it was under Trump who made the agreement, but eventually we had to get out. But there are ways of leaving that aren't going to leave scars and bodies, right? If you think that's the only way to do it, then that's the only solution you're going to see. Instead of talking, instead of just doing it like a human being. But instead, we created this context. We created an environment of strife, of anger, of violence. And then we push back against those people and see them as the threat when we're we've been the ones who's been the threat for generations. And what did we do? Somebody made the decision to drone strike the crowd. Who in the hell thinks that way? Who in the hell thinks that that's the right response to a humanitarian crisis, is to bomb the crowd? This is absolutely essential to understand. Right here. Here we go. U.S. border agents are removing Haitian migrants using horses and whips. This is how we view, in the United States, this is how we view other cultures and other people. We see them as exploitable. We see them as backwards because they're not as interested in technology and wealth as we are. And we see them as deserving of any harm that comes to them for their lack of sharing our values. And it makes it okay for us to think in terms of drone strikes. This is the number one problem I've had with my country for about as long as I can remember. The moment that we started doing drone strikes, killing people from afar, where we wind up with killing civilians accidentally. It's the killing of civilians is built into the model of acceptable losses. So therefore, we're intentionally doing it. I can't believe that we do that. It's so wrong on every level. That's just one example of how our current models of racism extend into foreign policy. And we don't want to be held accountable for that. Because if you talk to an American about drone strikes, it's like, well, we got to fight them over there so we don't have to fight them here. No, motherfucker, we were actually over there causing the problem. and they're just trying to survive us.
Yeah.
And of course, when they mount an effective resistance, then we got to kill groups of them. And it's I don't want to get into the morality of it. I just want to say this is not a tactic that works at all. And all it does is expresses our racism on every level, because we see other people as less valuable than us. And I think that's the space I want to move away from and move into a space where we're talking about human beings with vulnerability in a way that actually makes voices equal, makes people matter, because people do matter. And that's the thing. That's the hardest part for me as an American, is having to force feed myself this notion that Americans are better than other people. Who the hell decided that? How did that get decided? That blows me away. We may have more. We have the ability to amass wealth and exploit vulnerable populations better than a lot of people, but that doesn't make us better people. So your thoughts on that before we close, because there's a lot we're going to talk about, and I'm hoping this is a foundation for the tone for what the kinds of cases we're going to talk about going forward.
I was just going to comment and say that I think that as Canadians, we have this facade that we are just accepting, and everyone can come and we'll protect you and we'll take care of you. And there's no racism. There's this facade that everyone puts up that it doesn't exist, but it does. And it's dangerous, but it's not as in your face, I guess I would say, as the US at this point. But
yeah,
it exists here, but everyone wants to pretend that it doesn't.
Thanks to Trump, we have found that our racists now believe it's fully acceptable to even form political parties and political movements around the notion of white nationalism, they're calling it, but it's still white supremacy. That's very clear. That's the problem. And this isn't about me hating my culture or hating my country. I love my country. I love the Constitution of the United States, except the part that denies the existence and rights of, all people who are not white landowners. If anyone anyone thinks that the Constitution of the United States is a perfect document, you need to look up the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision basically said, black people aren't people and they're never going to be. That's what it said. The U.S. Supreme Court decided that, and it had to be undone over a generation, but it was awful, and that's how we view other people. I don't hate my country. I don't hate my Constitution. I just, like everything else, I think we have a lot of accountability, and I think we have a lot of things we need to fix so that everybody can be together going forward. But we are not together in the current system. The current system is designed to create institutional blockades, it is institutionally violent towards those vulnerable and protected populations. And we're going to explore that in our cases. We're going to explore that in how we examine cases, how we talk to people. The work that you and I are doing, for example, is already having an impact on the investigators that we work with, because they are taking the human rights perspective into their cases. And sometimes they're the first people to talk to victims as though they might need help, that they might need access to resources, because law enforcement's not doing it. They're not doing it at all. They're failing in their mission to actually protect the victim. Like you said, they're focused on the offender. They're focused on making an arrest and taking credit as a hero. They're not focused on justice, which requires involvement of the victim and their family. Can you talk to us a little bit about your perspective on justice in that regard before we close out? Because I think that's really important to hear.
In the perspective of what exactly?
In the context of human rights, in terms of including the victim and the family in the process of actually, like, you have this person who's been harmed. Either they've been killed and you've got a family that's been harmed, or they've been violated, sexually assaulted, domestic violence, something has happened to them and they've been harmed. Now they're part of this process. And what the process does, as you started out by talking at the beginning of the hour, was that law enforcement's efforts essentially make them invisible to the process, make them exclude them from the process so they don't have to deal with them. And that's not the way it's supposed to work on paper, but in reality, that's what we're seeing. Tell me about your perspective of that, what you'd like to, the impact that you want to make or the changes you'd like to see. Because I think you have a pretty interesting take on this.
Yeah, it goes right to the beginning, I guess. This comment that is on the screen right now is kind of where I was going with that, going all the way back to the education.
Yeah, this is absolutely right. Let me explain why. Because there's two schools of thought. One is you need academics who can become law enforcement and affect policy appropriately and meaningfully. And the other is the model of the crime fighter, the overly bulked, with the machine gun across the thing and the visor and the, tactical gear. There doesn't seem to be an in-between anymore. Those are the two images. And the one of the educated cop is being denigrated to the point where many agencies are pulling the educational requirements so they can get more recruits. I'll give you an example. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say here, they're trying
Yeah.
to do the opposite. So they've released that they are going to be requiring some sort of college or university diploma before they can even apply to the police force. That being said, I know people with that background who have gotten to the police college, and the first thing that they were told was to forget everything you've learned.
That's
So
right.
it doesn't.
You're still here, brother. Don't bother.
Yeah, it's not making a difference what your educational background is in this recruiting system or in the education system within law enforcement. As I've told you before, when I got through to a couple interviews, I was told that my ethics were too high. So I wasn't equipped to be a law enforcement officer because my ethical standards were too high. I wasn't malleable anymore. And
You
I
weren't
have all
permitting
of
enough
those.
crime to happen in front of you. You need to be able to permit
Right.
crime to happen in front of you and by fellow officers. You need to be
So
able to
I have that education. Right.
Yeah.
I have the education that they require now, but I still hit a roadblock because I was too educated. So it looks good to say to the public that we are now requiring officers with more than a high school diploma and a fit to serve certificate. Now they need an educational background, but they're being asked to forget it. So I don't see a change happening at all in the near future.
No, because, and this is exactly what our colleague here, our learned colleague, who I'm pretty sure I know who it is saying that that they're being trained by field training officers. What has to happen is the old generation has to go. They are the old generation that has to be acknowledged is part of the problem for making sure that we have current officers who are capable of understanding the law, being compassionate and empathetic, and actually not using violence as the first option, not seeing violence as the first and only option in response. Violence should be the last option, not the first option. And that is not something that the older professionals tend to understand. That's a generalization because there are a lot of good older professionals that do understand that, but they move away from those people. They move to different departments. They go into duties that don't require that. So the problem is until the old ideas are gone, the new ideas cannot take root. But the new ideas will always have the seed of racism or bias or cultural attitude that embraces violence and criminality within itself in order to survive, to make it acceptable. That will continuously, it's a disease that gets transmitted generationally. And this is true in any profession, whether it's forensic science, law enforcement, government. We inflict the most damage on ourselves to perpetuate that system. It's so accurate.
I was going to say, I think that the older generation of the police officers are definitely adding fuel to the fire. But as I see in Canada, when I'm interacting with any law enforcement officer at all, I'm finding that the ones that I don't want to interact with are the younger generation, specifically the white male generation of cops, because there is so much ego and a lack of protocol. They don't care. They show up and they'll flash their badge and they might take some notes, but then there's no follow through. And they're very abrasive to the victim that they are dealing with. And that's my experience. I've seen it myself. I'm not just forming an opinion on something that I haven't experienced myself. Whereas some of the older generations of police officers have been more empathetic and more thorough with their investigation in particular areas, I would say.
So this comes down, you're talking about hiring practices. They're hiring people that don't have that skill set, that knowledge, but also they lack a gender perspective, they lack a racial perspective, and they lack a human rights perspective. They're hired specifically because they see these vulnerable populations as the problem and are willing to put the boot on them. And they're being hired because that's the attitude that they have. They want to use violence and aggression as the first means because so we can't, I agree with you. We can't, the boots on the ground right now are actually the younger white male, angry, this is where they got the bully who got the job as a cop stereotype is not far off from the truth. Then you have the older generation that hires them. At some point, the older generation is hiring these people. They're the ones who are responsible. And what I see in Alaska and I see in other states is a lot of gypsy cops who are moving around from place to place to place right before they get fired for doing horrible things. We hired a guy in Sitka who committed murder with a taser. And then guess what? He got sued because he and a group of other Sitka cops decide to taser an indigenous kid. Like 17 times. They drive tase him 17 times in a minute and a half for no reason at all. And they were just angry and pissed and thought he deserved it. They did it in the cell where they were 5 of those guys, and none of them got in trouble. The cop finally got asked to resign. The kid got an award of $450,000 or something like that after we got involved. But it's that kind of stuff. The hiring of the kind of person who wants to do that as their goal in their career is the mistake. So I think we can't separate the officers who are young and who are, responding to calls from the older generation that hires them and fails to supervise them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I also think that they're putting people in between. So they're hiring the younger generation that fit a certain mold, and we have that group that you're talking about. And like I said, in my experience, I was never interviewed once by an older generation white male, not even a younger white male. I was interviewed by women, mostly, and then by a different demographic than me. So it's like there's an in between, but I believe that it's all coming down from one place, but they're trying to make it look like it's not.
And the thing is, when you have good police, there's a lot of good police who work out there, a lot of good ones, and they can very quickly acclimate to a culture that's bad, or they got to quit and go find some other work somewhere else when they can.
Yeah, because they become the victim. They can become a victim within their own career because of that.
We worked, just to make this very clear, Aurelio and I have worked a lot of cases involving police officers who have been criminals, and a lot of cases involving police officers who've been victims that we've helped out. And invariably, it's women. Invariably, it's women in some other vulnerability, whether it's women who are in poverty, women of indigenous status, or women of some other intersectional. There are a bunch of intersectional variables that occur, and they go into law enforcement thinking they can help or thinking that this will protect them, and they actually become the victim of the culture that they're trying to embrace. It is a great irony. So we're going to be talking about all of these issues in episodes upcoming, and I really look forward to it. And
me too.
You are going to, I assume, disagree with me a lot. I hope that's what I hope.
Probably.
I tend to say things that are not always fully formed. So your function is not just to be smarter than me, but to make sure that I don't get away with saying stuff that's dumb. Because when Aurelio is not around, man, it's a problem.
Don't worry, I can do it.
That's all. That's all.
I can.
That's why you're here. I know you can. So I want to thank everybody for joining us on our first episode where we're just talking about general ideas so that you get a sense of what the future is going to look like. It's going to be much more structured. We're going to be much more professional. My little sound bar over there won't pick up everything on Bluetooth just like before. So I guess sound checks have to happen in advance. Is that what you're saying?
I think I mentioned that today.
You did, and then somebody brushed you off. That was inappropriate.
It wasn't appropriate.
Somebody said it was
start on time. Very unprofessional. Very unprofessional today. Just be better.
Rude.
No, be better.
Be a better version of whatever that is.
just be a better person. Okay.
I think we both know that's not going to be easy. Mount Everest, not one day. Thank you so much for joining us today. And Melanie, we will talk again next week.
Yes.